Welcome to Twin Whistles. I'm your host, Joe Chap. Detroit Tigers trade deadline has came and gone, and there are a lot of fallout from this trade deadline. Obviously, if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. We will keep you entertained with Detroit Tigers content and all Detroit sports content here on Between the Whistles Detroit. It was an interesting day for the Detroit Tigers and Scott Harris. We will get into the later half of what the parameters of what happened with Eduardo Rodriguez. We will get into that. First, we're going to give you a rundown of what happened today. So the Detroit Tigers traded Michael Lorenzen to the Philadelphia Phillies for Yuli. Yuli, an infielder prospect. Damn, that name really just jumbled me up. He's an infielder prospect. He doesn't strike out a lot. He's good defensively. That's what they say. The one thing I was reading about Lee was that it was MLB.com says Lee is a baseball rat who loves work on his hitting and makes a ton of contact. So obviously, if you're a GM, you're looking for a guy that just gets contact, because a lot of times what happens in baseball, they overlook the contact and they want to go to the home runs, and that's totally get it. But at the same time, sometimes the best thing is just to get contact. They also made a deal for Eddys Leonard from the LA Dodgers, and this wasn't the trade we thought was going to happen with the Dodgers, but it's an infielder prospect. He's a guy who will be heading to AAA Toledo. With the Dodgers AA affiliate, he was batting 254, 815 OPS, so not decent numbers, not great numbers, but if you're Scott Harris, you just he kicks at the can and see what kind of rolls over. Because with the Joe Jimenez trade, I mean, you got Justin Henry Malloy, and that looks like it could be a decent trade. So, look, that's all you're looking for, is just to take chances. You can take chances with the free agent market. You can take chances with the international pool. So what Scott Harris is doing there is good. Now, we have to get to what everyone is talking about. So the Detroit Tigers tried to trade Eduardo Rodriguez, and his trade he had a contract that was pretty, as I heard from a lot of people, was pretty resistant on where he can go and who they could talk to and all that. And one of the teams that was on his list was the LA Dodgers. Now, obviously, for Scott Harris and you're a general manager, you're always going to be in contact with your player, saying like, look, we're in discussions. Is this something that you would believe in? And sometimes it comes down to the last very moment. What happened here is just a reminder of what Al Avila did to this franchise. Because, look, a lot of times when you do a contract, you are literally going to put something in there where the player wants it, and you're going to put it in there just because. A lot of times you see it in hockey with the no movement clause, and then there's teams that he has to go through. And I was talking to a general manager one time, and he told me the worst thing in the world is a no movement clause. Worst thing in the world is a no movement clause. And if you are a Detroit Red Wings fan, you benefited from a no movement clause, because here's what happens. Let's say there's 10 teams that he will not be traded to, okay? And let's say those 10 teams, 5 of them include teams that are not going to trade from, because either one, they don't have the cash, they don't have the prospects, they don't have the trade capital to trade for him, or they're just not in position to trade for a player of that ilk. So you're down to like 4 teams or 5 teams, most likely. And that's what really, especially when you have teams that are like, they're not going to be trading. There's going to be teams that are just rebuilding. They're not looking to acquire pieces. So when you get to that point, you are in a little bit of you're in a little bit of a limbo. So you got to make best of it. And sometimes what happens is these general managers will go up to the guy that has the no trade clause. They'll say, look, we're talking to the LA Dodgers. We'll use the Dodgers as an example. And you say, what are the parameters for you to go to the LA Dodgers? And sometimes they could do a little bit of enticing in terms of money, in terms of certain perks or whatever. That could happen, especially in Major League Baseball. But what we see with Eduardo Rodriguez, and we heard from Scott Harris. You know, Scott Harris kind of alluded to it. There was a lot of things that prevented him from making deals with other markets. What that means is there was some deals that he could make because Eduardo Rodriguez just wouldn't go there. And I kind of go back to what that general manager I talked to said, like, look, 5 teams will be just crossed off the list. There's 10 teams that are crossed off the list. So if you have a 10-team no movement clause, and you're in a 30-team league and 10 teams get crossed off the list automatically, you're down to 10. And then there could be maybe 4 or 5 that say no, I can't make the deal because they don't have the prospects, or they don't have the trade capital, or whatever the case may be. So you're down to like 3 teams. That was the case in the Alex DeBrincat trade. You know, the Red Wings benefited from Alex DeBrincat wanting to go to Detroit. He really wouldn't move his no movement clause to go somewhere else. You saw that Dallas had to move capital to get him. Like, they had to move players to get him the salary cap space to get him. You've seen that like Vegas was interested in Alex DeBrincat, and they didn't have the cap to do it. That's the things that happen around sports. Like, sure, there's a ton of teams that are going to go in for Eduardo Rodriguez, and they're going to go in there and they're going to try to make a deal. But ultimately, what they have to look at is, okay, I have this going for me. I have this I can offer. This is my wiggle room, and I don't have much. In Major League Baseball, there's no salary cap. So what it comes down to is prospects. It comes down to trade capital. It comes down to what your positions of need are. Are you willing to take on a player who has an opt-out, which that could really, a lot of GMs that would be kind of like a free agent, so you're not going to give them something that's meaningful. So, look, Ed, you could look at Scott Harris and you could talk about him not getting anything for Eduardo Rodriguez, and ultimately what's going to happen is they're going to have to work out an extension with Eduardo Rodriguez. They're going to have to opt. He's going to have to opt out of his contract, and then they're going to have to work out an extension, because the way that Al Avila did these 2 contracts in the last year of his tenure with Javi Baez, with Eduardo Rodriguez, on premise they were smart. But now, knowing the hidden language and the hidden constraints that were in it, El Avila basically got walked all over in the contract discussions with Eduardo Rodriguez and Javi Baez. And I don't even want to know what's in Javi Baez's contract that's, could be in Eduardo's contract too, because look, Javi Baez is just it's been an absolute joke, but at least Rodriguez has some things. And look, there was a time last year where he went absolutely off the grid. We didn't hear from him for a while, so I think a lot of people were kind of upset about that. I think when you look at the way that Scott Harris was talking about the hidden language in the contract that kept him from making deals, what it tells me is I think Scott Harris wanted to get a deal done with and get Eduardo Rodriguez traded and give him to a good, contending team. Ultimately, what happens is there is probably language in that contract that was totally out of left field and totally it was totally player driven. And when you do that, sometimes you give too much power to the player, and sometimes you hand cut yourself as the general manager. If you're a Detroit Red Wings fan, you saw that with Ken Holland and some of the contracts that he made, where they're basically untradeable, they're unmovable, and you kind of just had to ride it out as bad as it was. And thankfully, Major League Baseball isn't a salary cap league like the NHL, so that's one positive. But still, you never like to hear how much power a player has in his contract, because ultimately it's gonna be bad for the organization. Ultimately it's gonna be bad. You look at it from the player standpoint, yeah, give what you can from the organization. And if you're talking to a guy like Al Avila, who is going to give you everything that you could ever want, take it. Take it. If he's going to give you no movement clause, take it. If he's going to give you this clause on, you know, we won't move you to these teams in the South, or we won't move you to these teams on the West Coast, except maybe the Padres, which that was one of the conditions. Um, take it. Take it. You know, there's a lot of power for these players now. And I feel like if you're a dumb general manager, you're going to get taken advantage of a lot. So I feel like this is one of the kind of the reminders of what the Detroit Tigers president of baseball operations is going to deal with. Because I don't think he realized what was in all these contracts that El Avila signed, and I think he's gonna go into Javi Baez's contract and go, holy shit, like what did he give him? Because you could tell it just right away. Like Scott Harris wanted to say, look, I couldn't make a deal. Like I was hand cut by what I could do and where I can move them, and obviously there's teams that are not going to be trading for him, and then there's going to be teams that aren't going to need pitching, and so I'm kind of hand cut on like 4 or 3 teams, and then if this is the case where, you know, like if you're the Tigers and you're talking to the Orioles and you're talking to the Astros, like as soon as the Astros got Justin Verlander, they were off the market. So, and then the Baltimore Orioles, like they probably weren't going to give away some of their prospects that they have. So then you're talking to the Dodgers and you're hoping that, you know, maybe Eduardo Rodriguez will waive his trade clause. That's what you're hoping. And you're talking to his agent. You're giving him like, look, this is what's going to happen. And sometimes it comes down to a little bit of perks. It comes down to a little bit of, there's negotiations that take place on the back end of the deal where, you know, the team that's taking them on could be like, look, we'll give you this, we'll give you this, we'll give you this, if you just come here and waive your no trade clause. And that does happen a lot in a variety of sports. It happens in hockey sometimes, it happens in baseball sometimes, it happens in basketball sometimes. So it's very, very kind of conscientious to look at that. But ultimately, what happened today was we saw the late effects of Al Avila. The late effects of Al Avila were these contracts were too opportunistic for the players. Like I said, I don't want to see Javi Baez's contract because I feel like I would just go in rage mode, just seeing the provisions and what he was given as a player when he shouldn't be given that. You know, one time I was talking to a general manager, and he was in a different sport. But one time when I talked to him, I said, "Look, I know a lot of teams, and I know a lot of players ask for, you know, no trade clauses. They ask for no movement clauses, all that stuff. Like, what's the parameters on do you give a player a no movement clause or a no trade clause?" And he said flat out, "If you think this player could be a player that helps you in the future, you absolutely do it with the no movement clause. And sometimes, you know, you acquire them with the no movement clause, so you're handcuffed a little bit there." But he goes, "You're not giving everybody a no movement clause." And if we look at it from this standpoint of what he just said, you know, he said we're not giving everyone a no movement clause. So you look at what we gave Eduardo Rodriguez, the no movement clause that he got. We don't know what Javi Baez's no movement clause is, and if he does got one. And I mean, like, look, I understand giving a no movement clause to Shohei Ohtani, okay? I understand giving a no movement clause to Miguel Cabrera. I understand giving no movement clauses to elite level players. Like if Tarik Skubal becomes an ace on the mound, I understand giving him a no movement clause. I don't understand giving a no movement clause to Eduardo Rodriguez and maybe Javi Baez. Like, they're not great players when you acquire them. Now, obviously, Rodriguez has been great with the Detroit, but ultimately, like, when you got him, you were not like, oh, this guy is an ace in the mound. Like, obviously, he was going to be the ace for you because you didn't really have anybody to take over as an ace in this league. So, this just shows the effects of Al Avila that he's having on the current team. because when you have a no movement clause for Eduardo Rodriguez and you have a no movement clause probably for Javi Baez, this shows you everything you needed to know about El Avila. He hamstrung the organization, and the guy who came in after him that he probably knew was going to come in, and because he knew the writing was on the wall, probably. Like what does it matter for El Avila to do something stupid to the Detroit Tigers because he's got no repercussions when he's fired. Like he's going to be fired. If things don't go right, he's fired. That's probably the way he was thinking of it, and that's exactly what happened with the Detroit Tigers. And you're starting to see the effects of that because you know that the Javi Baez contract is immovable because he's not playing at the top of his game, and he probably has no trade clauses to 10 teams, and that probably lays out probably his chances of getting dealt. Obviously, the way he's playing, he's not going to get dealt anyways. But when you get Eduardo Rodriguez, the no movement clause, no trade clause, it opens up a series of unfortunate events because ultimately what's going to happen is what's happened to Detroit with the Red Wings. Like you got the benefit of a no trade clause. They were kind of hamstrung on what they could give you. And ultimately the Detroit Red Wings took advantage because they only gave up, like very minimum, like they gave up a seventh prospect on the left-handed defensive spot. They gave up a roster player who was on a contract year, and they gave up like a third-round pick. That was because they had the leverage. And I'm sure when the LA Dodgers learned that they were on the no trade list for Eduardo Rodriguez, they probably said, "Screw it. Whoever we had on the board for you, if it was Michael Busch, it was one of those players, Andy Pages, they probably said, screw it. We'll give you a 10th prospect, 11th prospect, a 12th prospect." And at that point, it really puts Scott Harris in a bind because does he trade Eduardo Rodriguez for an 11th best prospect or 12th best prospect? Because what happened with El Avila and Justin Verlander, the Justin Verlander trade and the JD Martinez trade, it seemed like he traded just to get a trade done. Now, at the time, we thought the Justin Verlander trade was better than it was, but I never liked the JD Martinez trade where you were getting Dal Lugo and Alcantara, and that could have possibly been the case with Eduardo Rodriguez because if you're talking to the Dodgers and they know that the leverage is not on the Tiger side, they're gonna kind of scale back. They're gonna say, nope, we're not gonna do it. We're not gonna do it. And that could open up a huge, huge problem for the Detroit Tigers moving forward. And look, the only way that Scott Harris is gonna he's gonna survive this no matter what. But the opinions on the internet, they're gonna look for him to try to extend Eduardo Rodriguez, and it probably would be best because of the contract and what we're seeing with the contract. If he did, obviously he would have to opt out of his current deal, and then they would have to extend him. I don't know how that would. I don't know how the technical language will work, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with that because obviously we should have seen a trade with Eduardo Rodriguez going to the Dodgers, but he had a no trade clause, and ultimately that will put you in a bind. And look, Scott Harris walked into a mess, and today should be a total. If you're looking at it from a pragmatic standpoint, he walked into a mess, and it's still a mess. If you look at what Eduardo Rodriguez got, the no trade clause, some of the provisions in his contract, we don't know some of the provisions in his contract. That's the major thing. Like, what was in his contract that we don't know about? Now, a lot of people talk about, why didn't they trade relieving pitchers? Because they're under team control. I think that's why you did it. And if you're the Detroit Tigers, why would you get rid of players that you think that could help you next year? Because I think the Detroit Tigers will be in the running for next year. But ultimately, it comes down to what did Eduardo Rodriguez, what was the provisions in his contract that we don't know about? because Scott Harris knows something, because he kind of alluded to it, but he couldn't get into detail. It's interesting, very interesting. And look, we thought it'd be more. We thought we'd see more action with the Detroit Tigers, but we obviously didn't. But if you're a Detroit Tigers fan, man, this is a total kick in the balls. It's a total kick in the balls, and it's by your former general manager who basically put you in purgatory and made it to where these contracts that you have were basically so player driven that they're immovable, or they're very hard to move. And if I'm Scott Harris and you look at this, it's kind of like the Steve Eisman effect. Like, I don't want to do that thing again. Like, I don't want to make the same mistakes that that guy made because he's an idiot. And we all know Al Beal is an idiot, so it doesn't need to be talked about more. Um, but we're gonna have more videos on it. I think there's gonna be more stuff that's gonna come out about this contract, and we could talk about it in later videos. So if you're new to this channel, subscribe below. We'll keep you entertained with Detroit Tigers baseball information and reviews, and we're gonna do a lot of new stuff to help you guys out throughout the rest of the season. So stay tuned to that. And we will see you on the next video of Between Whistles Detroit Tiger Talk. And just remember, what Scott Harris walked into is just, it's not ideal by any stretch of the imagination. I'm Joe Chapman. I'll see you in the next video.